When you study racing history, it's easy to become obsessed with the victories, the championships, and the dominance of great machines piloted by legendary drivers. But sometimes, the most important stories aren't about triumph at all. They're about the precise moment when progress met catastrophe, when ambition collided with reality, and when an entire era was extinguished in an instant. This is the story of the Lancia Delta S4, and how one car came to symbolize the final, tragic chapter of Group B rallying. To understand the significance of the Delta S4, we must first travel back to 1982, when the FIA introduced Group B regulations with the best of intentions. The new category was designed to replace the aging Group 4 rules and usher in a new era of manufacturer competition. The regulations were deliberately permissive, almost shockingly so. There were virtually no restrictions on engine power, materials, or aerodynamic innovation. Homologation requirements were streamlined from 400 production cars down to just 200. And if you wanted to build an Evolution version, you only needed to manufacture 25. This was meant to democratize rally racing, to encourage manufacturers to compete, and to inspire technological innovation. What it actually created was a mechanical arms race unlike anything the sport had ever seen. The first years of Group B belonged almost entirely to Audi. Their Quattro, a four-wheel drive car with a turbocharged engine, arrived in 1982 and immediately began rewriting the rules of rally competition. Hannu Mikkola drove that early Audi with such ferocity that he nearly won the 1981 Monte Carlo Rally before brake failure denied him victory. When Group B officially began, Audi had already perfected four-wheel drive traction on loose surfaces, and they used that advantage mercilessly. For Lancia, a manufacturer with a storied rally heritage, this was simply unacceptable. Lancia had competed with the rear-wheel drive Rally 037, a car that represented the old guard of rallying. It was lightweight, nimble, and through sheer engineering brilliance and the talents of Walter Röhrl and Markku Alén, it won the 1983 Manufacturers' Championship, the last rear-wheel drive car ever to do so. But Lancia's engineers understood what everyone else was beginning to realize. The future of rally racing belonged to four-wheel drive. The grip advantages on gravel and loose surfaces were simply too great to ignore. The question was no longer whether to adopt all-wheel drive, but how to make it work in a rally car. In 1984, Lancia began developing what would become known internally as Project 038. This wasn't an evolution of the 037. It was a complete reimagining of what a Lancia rally car could be. The engineers working under Cesare Fiorio and Abarth took a blank sheet of paper and set out to build the ultimate Group B weapon. The result would be the Delta S4, a car that represented the absolute zenith of what unregulated rally car development could produce. The Delta S4's most famous feature was its engine, a 1.8-liter inline-4 that incorporated both a supercharger and a turbocharger working in concert. This revolutionary system, which Lancia called twin charging, was not the first time someone had experimented with supercharging and turbocharging together. But the Delta S4 was the first rally car to perfect the technology. The supercharger, driven mechanically from the engine's crankshaft by Abarth, provided instantaneous boost and response at low engine speeds. But as the engine RPMs climbed, superchargers become less efficient because of the parasitic load they place on the engine. This is where the Kühnle, Kopp and Kausch turbocharger took over. Operating independently and powered by exhaust gases, the turbo maintained an amplified boost at higher engine speeds, essentially giving the S4 two power sources working in seamless harmony. The engine produced somewhere between 480 and 550 horsepower, depending on the specification and conditions, absolutely staggering for a 1.8-liter engine in 1985. But power alone doesn't make a great rally car. The Delta S4's chassis was equally innovative. It featured a fully tubular space frame, the kind of construction normally reserved for pure race cars, not rally vehicles that had to handle rough mountain roads. The bodywork was a mixture of carbon fiber and Kevlar on race cars and polyester resin on the road-legal homologation versions, materials that were cutting-edge technology in the mid-1980s. The engine sat mounted transversely in the middle of the car, behind the driver. The suspension used double wishbones at all four corners with coil springs and telescopic shocks, and the whole package weighed just 890 kilograms, barely 2,000 pounds, for a car with over 500 horsepower. The four-wheel drive system, developed with help from Hewland and featuring ZF differentials front and rear with a viscous coupling in the center, was sophisticated and well-sorted. Even more remarkably, the Delta S4 retained visual kinship to the regular Delta that Lancia sold in showrooms, even though they shared almost nothing in common except a windshield and a grille. Because Group B rules required manufacturers to build road-going versions of their race cars, Lancia was legally obligated to homologate 200 Delta S4 straight-aisles for civilian use. The road-going versions retained much of the race car's structure, but were detuned to around 250 horsepower and equipped with luxuries like air conditioning, soundproofing, and Alcantara seats. Almost a contradiction when you consider the base was a barely civilized racing machine. Historians dispute exactly how many were actually built. Lancia claimed to have built the required 200, but evidence suggests the number was closer to 100 to 80 or 100. Like so many manufacturers in Group B, Lancia appears to have bent the homologation rules to their advantage. Not that anyone was paying close attention. The road car was, after all, almost irrelevant compared to what the racing version represented. But a car needs a driver to become a legend, and in 1985, Lancia found the perfect one. Henri Toivonen was a Finnish driver who had already established himself as one of the most talented and fearless competitors in rallying. He had made his name with a breakthrough win at the 1980 RAC Rally, becoming the youngest winner of a WRC event at the age of 24. Toivonen had an almost ethereal quality, a rock star charisma combined with a driving style that was both precise and wildly aggressive. He didn't just drive quickly, he drove as if possessed, as if his Scandinavian stubbornness wouldn't allow the laws of physics to apply to him. By 1985, at the relatively young age of 29, Toivonen had proven he was capable of extraordinary things, but his career had also been marked by terrible luck, mechanical failures, and the occasional crash. Still, when Cesare Fiorio, Lancia's racing manager, observed Toivonen's raw speed and relentless commitment, he decided that this was the driver who could unlock the full potential of the Delta S4. Toivonen joined Lancia in 1985 for a part-time program, and despite suffering a serious back injury and broken vertebrae in his neck from an early season crash, he showed immediate promise. He drove the older, rear-wheel drive 037 for much of that season and posted respectable results: a 6th in Monte Carlo, a 4th in Finland, a 3rd at San Remo, all while recovering from injuries that would have ended many drivers' seasons. But everyone could see that Toivonen was waiting for something better, waiting for the car that would finally match his talent. By late 1985, that car was ready. The Delta S4 made its competitive debut at the final rally of the season, and the results were staggering. Lancia finished first and second, a clear statement of intent for the 1986 season. The Delta S4 was faster than anything else on the planet. It could accelerate like an F1 car, 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in 2.8 seconds, and Fiorio would later claim that Toivonen was the only driver on the Lancia team who could actually use all of its potential. When the 1986 season began, Lancia was confident. The team had the car, they had the driver. They had everything they needed to win the championship. On the morning of January 17, 1986, the Monte Carlo Rally began, and Toivonen was instantly sublime. His teammate Markku Alén was in second place, but it was Toivonen who was orchestrating the event. He led the rally coming into the final day, but as fate would have it, rain fell and the conditions changed. Other drivers pushed harder, and Toivonen found himself fighting back, clawing his way through the field with the kind of determination that became his trademark. On the final stage, he made a brilliant tactical decision that put him back in contention. And when the Monte Carlo rally ended, Henri Toivonen, the The young Finn in the revolutionary Lancia Delta S4 was the victor. It was his first World Rally Championship win in 5.5 years. The motorsport world took notice. This was going to be Lancia's year. This was going to be the Delta S4's era. But sometimes, what looks like the beginning is actually the beginning of the end. What's difficult for modern audiences to understand is that in the early to mid-1980s, Group B rally cars were being pushed into an environment that they had quickly outgrown. As the machines became more powerful and more sophisticated, the rally courses themselves hadn't changed much. Rally stages were still being run on narrow mountain roads, with sometimes inadequate safety provisions. The roads around Corsica, particularly the infamous Tour de Corse, were treacherously narrow with sheer drops on one side and rock faces on the other. The speeds being achieved were completely unprecedented for these roads. The first major tragedy of the Group B era came in May 1985 at the Tour de Corse rally in Corsica. Attilio Bettega, an accomplished Italian driver, was racing his Lancia 037 when he lost control at a corner and crashed directly into a tree. The impact was catastrophic. Bettega died instantly, crushed in the cockpit. His co-driver, Maurizio Parisino, was miraculously uninjured. Bettega's death sent shockwaves through the racing world, and for a moment, questions were raised about the safety of these machines and the courses on which they raced. But the sport moved on. It was Corsica, after all, a notoriously dangerous rally. Accidents happened there. Racing was dangerous. This was accepted as the price of competition. By 1986, however, the danger had become almost unbearable. In May, as the season was gaining momentum, the World Rally Championship came to Portugal for the Rally de Portugal. The event was held near Sintra, on a road called Lagoa Azul. The spectators, fans eager to see the fastest rally cars in the world, lined the stage in great numbers. The driver briefings before the stage were contentious. Multiple drivers voiced serious concerns about crowd control. There were simply too many spectators packed into too small a space, standing inches from the edge of the road with nowhere to go if something went wrong. The organizers acknowledged the concerns, but essentially shrugged their shoulders. This was rallying. The crowds came to see the cars go fast. There was nothing to be done about it. On May 6, 1986, Portuguese driver Joaquim Santos took the wheel of a Ford RS 200, one of the most powerful and aggressive Group B cars ever built. His co-driver was Miguel Oliveira. As Santos entered the stage, rain had recently fallen, and the road surface was damp. The speed of these cars was such that even slight mistakes could be catastrophic. About a third of the way down the stage, on a slight crest in the road, Santos hit a bump and lost traction. The rear of the RS 200 slid out, and in that instant, he made a decision that would change rallying forever. Trying to avoid spectators standing on his right, he steered right, which only made things worse. The car careened directly into a crowd of spectators. The RS 200, with its 550-plus horsepower and its complete lack of concern for safety or crash protection, plowed through the crowd like a missile. When it finally came to rest, it was on fire. The engine was still running, the turbocharger glowing hot, the fuel spilling everywhere. Spectators lay strewn across the road, many critically injured. When the dust cleared, 3 people were dead, and more than 30 others were seriously injured. Among the dead was a mother and her young child. This wasn't a racing accident. This was a massacre, broadcast live to the watching world. The shock to the motorsport community was profound. The leading teams, horrified by what had happened, made a collective decision to withdraw from the rally. The surviving stages were cancelled, and the drivers went home shaken. In paddocks and motorhomes across Europe, serious conversations began about Group B's future. But the season continued. The cars were too fast, the situation was unprecedented, and no one quite knew what to do. If Portugal was a warning, then Corsica would be the cataclysm. The Tour de Corse began on May 1, 1986, a year to the day after Attilio Bettega had died on the same roads in his 037. Lancia came to Corsica with a heavy heart, remembering their lost driver. But they also came with Henri Toivonen, who was leading the championship, hungry for another victory. Toivonen was sick, he had the flu and a sore throat, but he was determined to race. He had lost his championship lead recently due to withdrawals and retirements, and he felt the pressure to prove himself once again. Toivonen was like that, proud, stubborn, unwilling to accept that circumstance could stop him. The first day of the rally went relatively well. Toivonen was competitive, charging through the stages with his usual intensity. On May 2nd, the second day of the rally, Toivonen was in second place overall, chasing the leader. On the 18th stage of the day, called Corte Taverna, a winding mountain road through Corsica's interior, Toivonen was pushing hard. At the 7th kilometer of this stage, there was a tight left-hand corner with no guardrail, just a sheer drop into a ravine below. What happened next remains unknowable. Toivonen's Lancia Delta S4 left the road and plunged down the ravine. In that instant, he made no attempt to brake, no sign of correction. It was as if he simply didn't see the corner, or the grip simply wasn't there, or something mechanical failed, or 1,000 other things that were never determined. The car somersaulted down the ravine, and when it came to rest upside down, it was on fire. The aluminum fuel tank underneath the driver's seat was ruptured by trees, and combined with a red-hot turbocharger and the leaking fuel from the ruptured tank, the car was engulfed in flames within seconds. There was no one to see it happen. There were no marshals nearby. There was no video footage. There were only the blackened remains of the space frame, charred Kevlar fragments scattered across the ravine, and the knowledge that Toivonen and his co-driver, Sergio Cresto, a talented American co-driver barely 26 years old, had died instantly in the crash. The car, a machine that represented the absolute pinnacle of rally car engineering, had become a funeral pyre. Within hours, Jean-Marie Balestre, the president of the FISA, made an announcement. Group B was banned, effective immediately. For the end of the 1986 season, no more Group B cars would be allowed to compete in the World Rally Championship. The decision was swift, unilateral, and final. Audi, already planning to withdraw after the Corsica rally anyway, made the announcement official. Other manufacturers quietly agreed. The sport's governing body had spoken, and the wildest, most dangerous, most innovative era in rally history was over. The aftermath of Toivonen's death was unlike anything the sport had experienced. The driver was a superstar, a young man at the peak of his powers, taken away in an instant. Drivers who had competed alongside him found themselves struggling to cope. The accident report attempted to determine what had caused Toivonen to leave the road, but it proved impossible. Without witnesses, without video, without telemetry, it remained a mystery. Some blamed the unforgiving Corsican roads. Others questioned whether the fuel tank skid plate, which wasn't fitted because the route was all asphalt, should have been. Still others wondered if there was a mechanical issue, a brake failure, a suspension problem, something that simply couldn't be identified from the wreckage. What was clear was this. The Delta S4, despite representing the absolute peak of what four-wheel drive rally technology could achieve, had become symbolic of Group B's ultimate failure. The cars had become so powerful, so fast, that they had exceeded the ability of drivers to control them on mountain roads and of organizers to keep spectators safe. The combination of 550-plus horsepower, sophisticated all-wheel drive systems, and narrow rally stages with inadequate safety precautions had created an impossible situation. The sport had reached an evolutionary dead end, and that dead end was marked by tragedy. But before Group B faded into history, it's important to understand what it actually was, because the Delta S4 wasn't an aberration. It was the inevitable conclusion of the rules as written. Every manufacturer that competed in Group B pushed the regulations to their absolute limits. Peugeot's 205 T16 was a mid-engine car with a transverse-mounted engine and an incredibly complex all-wheel drive system. Ford's RS200 was a clean-sheet design with a Cosworth turbo engine and aggressive styling. Audi's Sport Quattro S1 was a technological masterpiece with a brute-force approach to turbo power and an aggressive aerodynamics package. The MG Metro 6R4 was an unconventional V6-powered alternative. Citroën had the BX4TC. Renault had the 5-turbo. Every single one of these cars represented the absolute bleeding edge of what rally car engineering could accomplish with minimal restrictions, and that's what made Group B so spectacular and so terrifying. From 1982 to 1986, these cars evolved from around 250 horsepower to over 500 horsepower. The rate of technological advancement was breathtaking. Manufacturers were spending millions upon millions of pounds in francs and lire on these programs. The engineering was genuinely innovative. Twin-charging, sophisticated four-wheel drive systems, composite materials, aerodynamic sophistication that was considered radical at the time. But the roads hadn't evolved. The safety standards hadn't evolved. The understanding of how to protect drivers and spectators from machines this powerful simply hadn't existed when Group B was introduced. Looking back on it now, with decades of hindsight, it seems obvious that the system was doomed to fail catastrophically. But in the moment, to the engineers, the drivers, the team managers, and the fans, it didn't feel that way. It felt like the future of motorsport. It felt like progress. It felt like innovation and speed and technology advancing beyond what anyone had previously thought possible. That's what made Toivolin's death so shocking. It punctured the narrative that had developed around Group B, the idea that these were wonders of the modern age, that the risks were worth taking. The Delta S4, in particular, represents what might have been. If Henri Toivolin had lived, if the Portugal crash had never happened, if Group B had continued for another year or two, what would have happened? Would manufacturers have continued pushing the power output? Would someone have been killed spectacularly in front of millions of television viewers? Or would the sport have found a way to evolve beyond the primitive safety standards of 1986? We'll never know because the decision was made to stop it all at once. But there's an interesting footnote to this story. Lancia continued in rallying, moving into the Group A category with the Delta HF four-wheel drive, and later the Integral, which competed throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. The Delta Integral, in fact, became one of the most successful rally cars of all time, winning multiple manufacturers' championships and establishing Lancia as a genuine force in rallying. It was slower, less powerful, less innovative than the Delta S4, but it was also safer, both for the drivers and for spectators. Henri Toivolin's legacy is complicated. He won just 10 World Rally Championship events in his career, a modest total compared to some of his contemporaries. But he did so with a style and aggression that few have matched. He was the young phenom who seemed destined for greatness, the driver everyone believed would win championships and set records that would stand for decades. His death at age 29, in a car that represented the absolute zenith of what an era could produce, locked him into a kind of tragic immortality. He became a symbol of Group B's end, forever young, forever at the moment when everything seemed possible, before the moment when it all came crashing down. The Lancia Delta S4 was never allowed to reach its full potential. The road cars faded into obscurity, becoming sought-after collectibles for enthusiasts. The racing versions were relegated to history, their achievements, their technological innovations, and their tragic association with the sport's darkest moment preserved in photographs and video footage and the memories of those who witnessed that era. What Group B represented above all was a willingness to push beyond the boundaries of what was safe or reasonable in pursuit of pure speed and technological advancement. The manufacturers weren't villains. They were following the rules as written. The organizers weren't negligent. They were trying to manage an unprecedented situation. The drivers weren't suicidal. They were trying to win at the highest level of competition. But somehow, the combination of all these elements created a perfect storm of danger that built toward an inevitable tragedy. If you study motorsport history, you'll find that every major regulation change, every major safety reform, came about because of accidents. The guardrails that line modern racetracks exist because drivers died in crashes. The restrictor plates that limit power in NASCAR exist because of fatal accidents. the halo device in Formula One exists because of the death of Jules Bianchi. This is the brutal reality of racing. Progress in safety comes through tragedy. The ban on Group B was no exception. It was a necessary response to a situation that had become untenable, but it was a response written in blood. The Delta S4 remains one of the most celebrated rally cars of all time, not because it won championships, it didn't, but because it represents a moment in automotive history when the boundaries between what was possible and what was safe became dangerously blurred. It is remembered as the car that killed Group B, but more accurately, it was the moment when Group B, in reaching its absolute zenith, finally encountered something it couldn't overcome: the limits of human technology and human safety in the pursuit of speed.